Hello, this is Tim Congdon, Chair of the Institute of International Monetary Research at the University of Buckingham. It's September 2022, a difficult moment for world politics as well as economics because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and some of the consequences of that. As one of his latest moves, President Putin has interrupted the supply of gas to Western Europe, and this has pushed up the price of gas quite dramatically, and this then affects the price of electricity. And some extraordinary forecasts of inflation have appeared. Goldman Sachs, even a few weeks ago, even came up with a number of 22% for inflation in the UK sometime next year. Now, it's not my job as an economist to talk about geopolitics and military matters, but I am concerned about inflation. So what I want to discuss in the present video is whether Putin is clearly taking some kind of gamble with Russia's gas energy exports, and to consider whether what Putin has done is a masterstroke or a blunder. I'm going to talk a bit about the position of Russia in the world economy in general terms, and then move on more specifically to the energy market. First of all, let's just look at a chart showing the ratio of Russian output to world output, where we're thinking in terms of current prices and current exchange rates. This is not the same thing as another method of carrying out this, where we kind of ignore some of the price differences between nations, so-called purchasing power parity basis, which is much more stable. This is a figure that's affected, for example, by the value of the ruble, which is in turn affected by oil and gas prices. Now you can see that in 2012 and 2013, when energy prices were very high, on this basis, Russian output was about 3% of world output. Not that different, by the way, from some of the main European countries. The price of energy, oil and gas, then came down in 2014, 15 and 16. Russia invaded the Ukraine and sanctions were applied. The ruble fell, and you can see a collapse in the Russian share of world output. More recently, the Russian share of world output has been a bit under 2%, and the final numbers here, which are projection from the International Monetary Fund, are that it comes down towards 1.5%. So Russian output in the next few years, 1.5% to 2% of world output, 2% at most. It's these kind of numbers that we should have in mind. Obviously, Russia is not a superpower. Now let's compare this with the West, because effectively what's happening in Ukraine is a battle of wills rather than a military battle, a battle of wills between the West and Russia, with the West supplying military and other support to Ukraine in the fighting with Russia. The advanced nations of the West here include North America, United States and Canada, obviously, Europe, including European Union and the UK, Japan, Australasia, and then one or two other places. These are all numbers from the International Monetary Fund. The IMF regards Taiwan as an advanced nation. Anyway, 10 years ago, these nations accounted for about 2/3 of world output. It's come down because of the rise of China, some extent of India. And so it's now, depending how it's measured, it's more like kind of, say, 55%, this kind of number. There's no doubt there's a kind of a battle of wills, certainly, between the West and Russia. And this shows you the relative size of the West and Russia in a single chart. Well, you can hardly see Russia, can you? And this is very, very important in understanding what's going on. The combined GDPs of the advanced nations of the West are about 32 times those of Russia. Obviously, there isn't direct fighting between the West and Russia, but the West can supply military and other support to Ukraine. It hardly touches these nations in any serious way, the cost of it, and yet those supplies give Ukraine the ability certainly to match Russia on the battlefield and perhaps even to defeat it. So that is the wider picture of Russia's position in the world economy. It's totally outnumbered by the West. Of course, Putin has tried to play a trump card. He's tried to play the trump card, as he sees it, of gas exports. And there was an article in the Telegraph on the 31st of August by Alistair Heath, whom I generally admire, saying that the result was a kind of disaster for Western Europe and might lead to economic meltdown and disaster, even socialism. I don't think that's right, as we're going to see in the next few minutes. Let's first of all just have a look at the size of gas exports to Europe, Russian gas exports to Europe in a normal year, compared with the GDP of whole of Europe, where we combine the European Union and the UK, which is kind of the European energy market. The figures are given here. You can see they show that the value of Russia's exports of gas to in total, by the way, not just to Europe, were 41.6 billion in 2019, 25.3 billion in 2020. That was affected by COVID, and then 55.5 billion last year. Some of that goes to China, not very much. The combined GDPs of the European nations, I've left out Switzerland and other bits and pieces, but basically the correct number, are kind of, for 2019, 18,000, almost $600 billion. 2020, affected by COVID, down a bit, 18,000 or so billion dollars. And last year, 20,300 or so billion dollars. In other words, in this normal year, normal gas prices and so on, imports of gas from Russia are about 1/4% of Europe's GDP. Now, the notion that this could cause meltdown, socialism and so on is, to me, ridiculous, utterly disproportionate, totally disproportionate to the real importance of this. The problem here is this short-run inelasticity of supply. We need electricity, we need heating in the winter, and this is what has these apparently very dire consequences for gas prices, electricity prices, living standards, and so on. But in fact, this is not when we look into the medium and longer term, this is not really a very difficult problem to solve. We should just note here that historically most trade between nations in gas has been by pipeline. In the last 10 years, particularly the last 5 years, that has changed radically because of the growth of trade in liquefied natural gas. It's traded in tankers. As long as a nation has the infrastructure in place in terms of docking facilities and storage facilities, it can import LNG, and then there is a world market in gas. Not quite the same thing as in oil, but there is a world market in gas. Now, although Russia's exports of gas to Europe are one of the largest items in international trade in gas, they are in fact only 5% of world production. That was last year. They were only 5% of world production. So in the decade up, in 8 years to 2019, world output of gas rose by about 2.5% a year. That could easily be raised to 3 or 4% for a couple of years. But even more important is that there has been, as I say, this revolution in international trade in gas because of the emergence of LNG. And this chart shows you how in the years since 2015, the exports of LNG to other countries have risen year by year by enormous amounts. I think we've gone up from around about a bit above 300 billion cubic meters up to about 500. That's last year. It'll be much higher, by the way, in 2022. But we may just thank BP for these figures, the BP Statistical Review of World Energy. That increase in LNG trade in that period of about 5 or 6 years is equal to, in fact, somewhat larger than the Russian gas exports to Europe. When we look ahead 2, 3, 4 years, it isn't difficult to see how Europe can get by pretty easily by dispensing entirely with the supply of gas from Russia, whatever the short-term problems. Well, in the event, governments have interfered in the energy market. The increase in gas prices and electricity prices isn't coming through in full to households. And in some sense, rightly so, because of the longer run supply situation is much easier than these short run little difficulties. In the long run, inflation is determined by excessive growth of the quantity of money. These sort of developments, these sort of accidents of war, if you wish, accidents of geopolitics, shouldn't be allowed to interfere with monetary policy. In the end, inflation is determined by money growth being too fast relative to the growth of output. I don't deny, of course, that in a sense what Putin has done here is to interrupt output. He's interrupted the supply conditions of an important commodity. But that won't change the underlying fundamentals in which it's so important to look at what's happening to money relative to output in order to understand what's happening to inflation. Thank you.